Hi, it's Mandy Kirk. I'm a creative producer at Prologis, and I want to welcome you to this episode of Moving the World. In this episode, Stephen Hussain of Prologis sits down with Safiya Ghori-Ahmad from APCO Worldwide. Together, they unpack how public-private partnerships can clear bottlenecks, streamline trade, and make supply chains smarter. I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation. So, let's get moving.
Good morning, Safia. How are you?
Good. How are you, Stephen?
I'm great. Thanks for joining us. I'm excited to have this conversation. It's a lot to dive into as we talk about the world of tariffs and geopolitics and everything else that's happening. So appreciate you being here.
No, thank you. It's always great to be with you and looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to dive in. You have a fascinating career and background, and I'm always so interested to know how people got their start and what their journey has been. So love to hear, how did you get into this world?
Yeah, it's a little bit like most things, it's sort of unplanned. I moved to Washington, D.C. after law school and was really grateful to work in the administration and ended up working at the State Department on South Asia. And my family's actually Indian, and so I grew up going to South Asia and to India as a child, and had always sort of been fascinated with understanding political issues and domestic policy issues. And so when I had the chance to work on foreign policy issues, I was kind of thrust into the world of South Asia policy and spent a good bit of my career working on foreign policy issues in Asia, for the last 20 years.
Yeah. And you've been in the private sector a while now, advising companies and partners across the world of how to deal with these types of issues and the complexity that comes with that. And you were actually just in India, and I'm interested to hear your take of how has the country changed in the last 15 years, and given everything that's happening, what's the future look like for India?
Yeah, that's a great question. I spend a lot of time in India. Like I just mentioned, I help a lot of our clients sort of navigate geopolitical issues, but more specifically, how to navigate U.S.-India relations. And like I just mentioned, I spent most of my summers growing up in India. So watching this transformation over the last 15, 20 years has been really remarkable. So I was just in India a few weeks ago. I think you've probably seen the statistics, which it's that, India is the fastest growing major economy in the world, and it's the fifth largest GDP, and it's supposed to be the third largest economy by the end of the decade. So surpassing China in terms of population and median growth income and all of this sort of statistics that make it interesting and fascinating for companies who are looking for emerging markets to invest into. Some of the things that have really changed over the last few years, which I'm really excited about, are the digital economy. So India has this digital stack, which is, it's interesting to wrap your head around, but it's an open infrastructure stack. It's literally the most advanced in the world for its kind. And it allows the economy to be totally paperless, totally cashless. And as a child growing up in India and sort of navigating the rupees and converting your dollars to rupees, and now seeing the street vendor who's selling your vegetables on the corner completely cashless, to walking across the street and getting a rickshaw, hopping in a rickshaw with your vegetables totally cashless, navigating the country in a way that's completely, your ID is a digital, everything is digital. It's in a way that's probably more advanced than we have here in the US. So seeing India progress to something in the digital space that's so advanced is truly remarkable for the economy that it is. The other thing that I'd say is it's the thing that I would say that's changed, that's interesting to watch as an American, is it's India's geopolitics, right? So India is really asserting itself and what it calls their strategic autonomy. So you'll see Vladimir Putin traveling to India for an official state visit by the end of this week, in which India will announce major defense deals, major tech deals with Russia. And India is not shying away from its strategic relationship with countries like Russia and with countries that which create that tension between the U.S. and India. And India is very going from non-alignment to strategic autonomy over the last 10, 15 years has really taken this position that India is at a leader in the global south and wants to take a position geopolitically where they'll do what's best for their political and their national interests.
And that really leads me to my next question, which is, you and I have been doing this a long time. I don't know if any year has ever felt like this year, where, in many ways, uh, you're starting to see a shift in obviously the world order, right? And the way that we have historically thought about trade, the way that we historically thought about economic development, that is different now. And, one of the things I have been telling people is that this isn't a temporary blip, right? This isn't about a single administration. These are structural changes that are here for the long term. I guess my first question is, what are you seeing, right? And you advise many companies all over the world, and how are you helping them think about the future?
Yeah, so I think it's a great question because I feel like I think about risk and geopolitical risk all day, every day. Like I'm constantly gaming out, and you are too. We're thinking about this and talking about this all the time together. Oftentimes, is how do you sort of think about what actions are going to create a reaction which impacts your business?
Yep.
And we're thinking about that for our clients every day. But one of the things that has really impacted, I would say, a majority of our clients is tariffs. And if you think about the first Trump administration, the tariffs that went into place, many of those that stayed in place during the Biden, I would say 75% of those stayed in place during the Biden administration, while the Biden administration did roll back some tariffs like on European steel and sector-specific tariffs. In large part, those were there to stay during the Biden administration. And I think, after this administration, at the end of this 4-year term, if Democrats were to come into office, I definitely think that tariffs are here to stay for a variety of reasons. I think it's become a bipartisan issue. The fact that pushing back on creating American jobs, what does it mean for the American economy, and sort of creating that America First narrative has become a bipartisan issue because Democrats and Republicans realize that their constituents are thinking about these issues and how it impacts their constituents. And so I also think trade has become sort of politically toxic. Gone are the days where you could talk about these big, expansive trade deals, and I think that was something that was largely a part of what was emblematic of the Democratic Party. And I just think that that's forcing the Democratic Party to really rethink their position on trade. I also think industrial policy is a bipartisan issue right now. And so you see things like the CHIPS Act and, whether Democrats or Republicans believe that you have to subsidize, these policies, whether it's EV or solar or whatnot, to create a level playing field for U.S. companies when it comes to how China competes on equal terms, I think is something that both Democrats and Republicans have begun to realize. So in large part, unfortunately, I think tariffs are here to stay. Now, how they're targeted, whether they're blanket, whether they're specific sector, whether they're surgical. I mean, I think all of those are differing tactically, but
Yeah.
I do think that largely that's a tool that I think both parties will use in the future.
And as you work with so many global companies, and I think, and Prologis is a global company, and I don't think we ever got accustomed to what it was and what it means to have kind of these institutions. But I do think there is a bit of taking some of that for granted more broadly in the business community, and that it's different now, right? And so how are you thinking about advising your clients of how they need to organize and strategize going forward? Because it is structurally different.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things that we are definitely advising our clients as they're thinking about this shifting world order. And I think one thing is that you're kind of building in global risk, geopolitical risk into the enterprise level decisions that have to be made. And I don't think that happened previously. It was always this sort of government affairs role that was separate from the business or separate from the board decisions or separate from, I mean, it was always seen as this separate entity. And I think more and more we're seeing that companies are having to navigate that as a part of their business decisions. And that's a huge and important part of how companies are making decisions. During COVID and during the first Trump administration, companies were really caught flat-footed on this sort of China plus one strategy. I don't think companies have to think of it as China plus one. I think it's China plus multiple multiple countries, right? I think it's diversifying for those markets. So companies are now realizing that you've got to be in multiple, you've got to diversify your supply chains to be in multiple markets for those markets. China for China, India for India. Southeast Asia is becoming a huge and very important player for the region and for the world. And I think companies realize that they thought nearshoring was the solution, right? And nearshoring is a great solution, but it's not the only solution. And it's one of those things that once in the second Trump administration, when we saw the tariff rates come out, we saw that Southeast Asia, really the numbers are hugely advantageous. And those companies that in the first Trump administration and the Biden administration had really shifted to Southeast Asia and had diversified not just in Vietnam or not just in India, and not just picked one or two countries, but really thought more expansively into more broader geopolitical regions and thought about their footprints and thought about those markets for those markets, came out as winners. And I think that's a huge part of how companies need to think about their global footprint moving forward, is not just, it's the dollar and then we need to have a footprint in China, then China supplies to the world. I think those days are gone. And I think companies are having to navigate multiple resilient supply chains that are with suppliers that they have deep-seated relationships with in multiple markets for those markets. And I think that's how you're going to survive, this ever-changing dynamic global trade, environment that we're facing right now that isn't going to go away.
Yeah. I'm interested to hear your take on, how the global South plus, because I really think everybody's going to deal with this, but, the U.S. is having to think through what does the future of our economy look like, right? Artificial intelligence is, it is here, right? And it is growing and it will have broad implications for our economy. But, when I think about the global South and I think about, Asia more broadly, right? There has been their domestic politics have depended on moving people into the middle class and it increased economic gains. And what it may mean when you have something like artificial intelligence and the disruption to the economy that comes from that. I'm interested to hear what you're seeing and how they're thinking about that, because there's potential reward, but there's a ton of risk as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. And I think every country that I've traveled in, whether it's Brussels, whether it's London, whether it's India or Singapore, everyone's sort of grappling with this issue right now, as we are here in the US. I would say that like I mentioned earlier, I was in India, and India is hosting the Global AI Summit in February. Mm-hmm. So most US tech companies, most global US companies will be in India. Prime Minister Modi will be hosting and convening this sort of 2-day big global summit on AI. And in this vein, they've announced something like 1.2 billion in initiatives towards upskilling and building towards rolling out initiatives on fellowships, digital infrastructure, literacy programs, curriculum at universities, and US companies are investing in this. And so I think for countries that are leaning into initiatives like this, Indonesia, India, European countries, capitals that are leaning into these sorts of initiatives and are actually investing and spending the money on those sorts of initiatives, are going to be the winners here in sort of getting their populations, their communities built into how they think about this AI infrastructure and the upscaling that it's going to take. Obviously, I do think there's a lot of concern about the jobs that are going to be eliminated because of what AI is going to do for various industries. However, I think, what I heard when I was in India is that around the Global AI Summit is there's going to be hackathons, there's going to be investment in startups, there's going to be all kinds of new investments made towards the industry and creating an open environment for investment around the industry so that people feel and people are committed to being a part of the growth of the industry. I think that's going to be an important part of it, so people aren't left behind in those communities, especially in these emerging economies where the middle class has really risen and grown to be a part of the growth story in these economies.
So I want to, for those who, listen to this podcast, we have customers and others who are thinking about this, but we're government affairs professionals, you and I, like this is what we do. And we think about how we engage governments and build relationships. But how do you advise your clients and others to think about how they build, relationships in intermarkets that they haven't been into before, right? If let's say they've been operating in Asia for 2 decades, but don't have local relationships. How do they enter that? Or Latin America, right?
Yeah.
What's the way to think about it?
So I love that question, and I would love to get your thoughts on this too, because you're like an expert on this as much as I am. But I think people treat Asia as one market. They treat Latin America as one market, and you and I both know this as we share South Asian roots. South Asia is not one market. It's multiple markets. Latin America is not one market. It's multiple markets. And so you've got to have sort of a sort of localized strategy, and you've got to have localized relationships in your key markets. And I think that's really important. Companies are realizing that, you can't just have one big global strategy and try to problem solve around the world and have a Asia strategy and you've got to have a multi-market approach to the markets that you're in, because they're so different and they operate so differently. I also think we've seen a lot of like the China risk, the overreacting. I call it the overreacting around China risk. First of all, it's the world's number 2 economy. It's indispensable to supply chains. It's a key consumer base for everything, luxury goods, automobiles, industrial, like everything, semiconductors, everything. There is risk in operating in China, but most companies are not going to completely pull out of China. So I think for government affairs professionals, it's kind of navigating what the risk looks like and making sure that you have those relationships in the markets that matter, so that you can pick up the phone, Stephen, and say, oh my God, I need to talk to someone in Mexico. I need to talk to I need to solve the problem in India. I need to pick up the phone and solve an issue in Indonesia. And I think those are key markets where relationships matter. And I think for me and you, who are oftentimes on planes and helping facilitate these relationships and rekindling friendships and making sure that, our U.S. companies understand the political dynamics in other countries as well, right? So oftentimes, I think what we do is we translate what that means is this prime minister is headed into election. It's a very tight election. Like, these domestic politics matter in this dynamic, and you're operating data centers, or you're operating, your investments in these countries, but this is how it impacts that government. And so I think those are the kind of key dynamics that we really sort of impart. The other thing is that a lot of these countries, it's a long game, not a quick game, not a quick win. If you're entering into some of these emerging markets thinking that it's a quick win, that's where we come across a lot of like crisis calls, which is, I'm trying to get my money out, and it's a problem. And I think these are long-term investments. Like, companies are making a long-term bet on some of these markets like India and Southeast Asia and Brazil and other markets that are still tough to do business in. But I would love your thoughts on this too, Stephen.
My experience, I think it's really funny is the number of times I've had calls and meetings and people think that the situation they're dealing with is like fundamentally unique, and their place is fundamentally unique. Their country is fundamentally unique. And it's always me breaking to them like, it's not, right? Political actors are political actors are political actors, right?
Yep.
They have domestic politics they're dealing with. Everybody is worried about the same things. It's always economic development. It's always job growth. So when you really like drill down into the issues globally, it doesn't matter what market you go to. It's very different. Obviously, there are cultural differences. And you have to take that into account. But politics is politics. And every single country has the same challenges and issues. But everybody thinks they're unique. And I think that's makes you feel good. There's some national pride there, but I think the reality is quite different. And yeah, the number of times I've gone into meetings and it's really fundamentally the same issue. It's like, yeah, we're worried about electricity rates. I'm like, yeah, so is everybody else, right?
Everybody else.
Yeah, so I think that's been my experience doing this work. And what's really key, though, is trying to check your bias at the door, right? Like I'm an American. And when I go and work with our team in Mexico, I have to think about it through the Mexican context, including the Mexican political context, not the American political context. And that's how you get success. But I think relationship building is so deeply undervalued because it's hard to show return on investment immediately. But that's how the world works, especially the political world. It's relationships, it's trust, and that takes time and it takes kind of commitment to make that happen. So I think you're 100% right, though. Like these markets, including if you were entering the American market, like it's not fast, right? It's all markets are slow, and you have to adapt to
That's so true.
Yeah. As I look at like what's happened this year, and particularly with U.S. policy towards global trade, I look out and I feel in some ways that maybe Europe was the most surprised by what happened, and it feels a little bit like they were caught off guard. Whereas Asia, in some ways, was expecting this. I think Latin America was certainly. I don't get the sense that they were surprised, right?
No.
But I'm interested in your take as you're traveling through Europe and working with European counterparts. If there seems to be a little bit of shock by this, which fascinates me, given it was highly detailed in his campaign plans, and it didn't come to a surprise to me that this was coming.
Yeah, I think I think there was so much shock and so much anger when I was in Brussels. This was around the time that the deal was being negotiated with the EU. And I think they felt such disrespect, and they felt like, they are this traditional ally and we're a part of NATO. And they felt, and I think they had sort of underestimated our own political dynamics here in the US. And, and I exactly what you said, Stephen. I was like, the president has talked about this on the campaign trail and talked about Europe increasing its defense spending to match commitments made by the U. And I kind of talked about this, and I said he has not hidden his sort of disdain around these issues over the campaign. And I think they felt like that was bluster, and that once he would come into office, that those things would sort of be tempered. And so in the negotiation phase, I heard from European members of parliament who felt like they were not being treated as a traditional U.S. ally. They were not being treated as if in good faith, a good faith partner. And that was the part that was very shocking to people, as they felt like even those around the president and even those negotiating came to the table as if to treat European allies who have been such a longstanding NATO ally, right? And to treat them in such a way. And so there was a lot of frustration around that time. And I think it was so shocking to them to sort of hear that rhetoric coming out from the president. And I think a lot of it is his blustery style, and it's how he does deals and how he negotiates and how he, and it changes, right? And so I think I was trying to kind of share that dynamic about American politics and the American style of politics that we're in right now. But I think that took some getting used to in Europe.
What do you think that means long term for those relationships between the U.S. and Europe? And I guess, are they really rethinking this for the long term, or do they think this is going to change in the next administration, regardless of who it is?
I think they do. I think there's a feeling that they have to think of this as like they've always thought of themselves as this block. And I think there's much more of a Maloney has a relationship with Trump, and then Starmer has a relationship with Trump. And we have to think of this as, who are those people who have these bilateral relationships with the president? And thinking of how they bolster those and use those personal relationships as versus thinking of themselves as a bloc, I think has really sort of shifted their dynamic. And I think if you saw the way that around Ukraine and around the way that they've all shown up in talking to the president and showing up around negotiation of the peace deal, they're leveraging their personal relationships and their personal um, uh, you know, uh, that kind of dynamic, the deal making dynamic that they have, I think in a new way. I think Europeans are trying to figure out what your American political system what's happening. That's constantly the question I get is who are the Democratic Party? What's the Democratic Party gonna? What are they gonna do? What happens in the midterm? Does that change things? And I think a lot of these dynamics are what we're seeing are here to stay because of the fact that our population, I mean, I think our constituencies really do like the fact that it feels like to the American public that things are getting done. And I think the bigger question is how it impacts the economy and what that means in the longer term. But they're very much intrigued by our political system and what this means for the next 3 years.
Yeah, I think what caught me off guard maybe was there was, at least from, and this is my perspective, right? There was a sense to me that like, China, India, Mexico, Middle East, had a better read than Europe did.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Ways. And I don't know if it's just because they took him at his word or what it was, but they were prepared for what was coming. And I felt like Europe was not. And that has been really interesting to watch.
I think the style of politics is very much what you see in those parts of the world, right? Like that sort of deal making, the bilateral conversations. I think that's very familiar to a lot of those countries that you just mentioned. And I think that hasn't historically been the case with Europe. And so I feel like I totally agree with you. They were so caught off guard in a way that I don't think the others were. I mean, I think you saw so much of Southeast Asia lined up and get their trade deals negotiated so early on, so quickly, because they realized they were creating a framework agreement. They had to get the deal done. It was very strategic. It was very sort of, I mean, it was done in a bilateral way. It was very familiar to how things operate in the region to get a deal done. And I think that was very unfamiliar to Europe.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess, my next question is really, I think this does impact domestic politics in the U.S., but also domestic politics in all of these countries that we've been discussing. And in fact, when I look back at the 24 elections, incumbents lost everywhere, right? It was really a wave against incumbents. But I think you've continued to see very significant political domestic challenges in many of these countries, in Europe and elsewhere. And I wonder your take on what does this type of isolationism and protectionism mean from a domestic politics standpoint across the globe?
Yeah, I mean, I think, that sort of isolationism, I think, creates these like regional blocks, where you've got things like the Quad and you've got, these BRICS and sort of these different alignments coming together because you've got countries with similar sort of protectionist policies, which I think is problematic, and I think from a traditional point of a perspective where clients and companies that are U.S. companies have invested significant amounts of capital in these markets, and then you've got really shifting alignments taking place geopolitically. I think obviously it impacts U.S. companies, but global companies, foreign companies who are also looking to invest in the U.S. are also thinking about, does this make sense as a part of my 5-year, 10-year plan if geopolitically alliances are shifting? And so I think that's a big thing that we're seeing quite a bit of is, we had seen a lot of foreign companies really thinking about what their investments look like. And we've seen a big surge of those investments come through over the last year, just given President Trump's announcements around things. What that translates into over the next 4 or 5 years will be really something to watch because we've seen large numbers of investment announcements. around, a lot of tech companies, AI, a lot of data centers that are being built, a lot of commitments around those dollars from foreign companies. But what that actually translates into, what that means over the next few years is going to be really interesting to watch. And I think that's what companies are thinking about, right? They've built 5-year, 10-year plans around their investments approved by their boards. And then geopolitically, when things shift and trade deals are not announced or are announced or tariffs are announced, it shifts things significantly. And so these types of investment announcements have either been stalled or are being relooked at, and companies are really thinking about which countries are we making those significant investments in.
This year has been messy, and for I think everybody. But when you look out, particularly I want to ask about the U.S. China relationship. Do you see, the opportunity for normalization? I don't think you're ever going to go back to the way it was, but a level of stability. Do you see that as a place of opportunity?
I do see it as a place of opportunity. I do think that we'll continue to see this sort of up and down in the relationship, right? I think the warming between, President Trump and Xi Jinping that we've seen in terms of the recent conversations and the dialogue I feel like is not for me an indicator of something long term, but I do feel like it's a good signal. For the moment, I do think that this is going to be a long back and forth in terms of the relationship. But I do think in terms of things like export controls, um, pressures on foreign brands, I think you're going to still see a lot of those stay in place as from a national security perspective. But I don't think America and the U.S. can fully decouple from China for the reasons that I think I mentioned earlier, right? I mean, it's so integrated into the global supply chain. I think during the first Trump administration, when there was these far-reaching 301 tariffs on Chinese goods, I mean, it was just impossible for U.S. companies to diversify quickly enough to avoid those tariffs and to really think about how you put manufacturing in place in other parts of the world or in the U.S. for particular products. And I think those things are still being manufactured in China 10 years later. So I do think that the relationship, we're sort of forced in a place where we have to maintain some sort of a relationship. What that relationship looks like, I think, will be very rocky over the next several years. But I do think things could escalate if you see tensions with Taiwan. I think tech transfers are going to remain very, very, tense. I think you're going to continue to see these sorts of issues remain tense. But I do think the fact that there's open dialogue taking place and the fact that this administration seems to be taking a more level-headed approach around engagement with China is helpful to our clients, helpful to U.S. businesses.
We see some of what's happened as a really a tailwind for Mexico, which is already a very strong economy, strong market, but so much more potential. And you've seen Sheinbaum be a very successful and effective negotiator. When you look at the Mexican market and its role, particularly in connectivity to the U.S. market, kind of long term, where do you see the opportunity, and what are the still pending risks?
Yeah, I mean, I think Mexico, there's huge opportunities with the renegotiation of USMCA next year. I think Sheinbaum is phenomenal in terms of her negotiation style. I think she understands President Trump. I think she knows how to negotiate with him. I think she knows that President Trump needs her on immigration policy. She is someone who can stem the flow of migrants coming across the southern border. She is someone who can help him achieve his goals on immigration, which are very, very important to his domestic agenda. I think there's some levers that she holds when it comes to understanding how to negotiate with the administration on the issues that are important to her when it comes to manufacturing in Mexico, ensuring that Mexican companies, maintain zero tariffs, and making sure that, there's things that obviously are still sticky, rule of origin requirements, those sorts of things. But I think we're going to see a lot of progress with Mexico over the next year. And I think it's very promising to see that relationship develop.
So we've spent a lot of this podcast talking about risks and challenges and issues. There's a lot to be hopeful to
Yeah.
as well. And I'm interested. Again, you've been doing this a long time, and when you look at kind of the long-term trends, like global health has significantly improved, global economic development has significantly improved. The number of people moving out of poverty has been remarkable over the last 30 years. Looking forward, what are you still hopeful about?
Oh, that's such a great question, Stephen. I'm hopeful about a lot of things. I feel like we spent a lot of time talking about Asia. I'm really hopeful. When I go to Asia, I feel a lot of hope because I grew up, like I said, my parents immigrated to the U.S. In the 60s, and I grew up in the U.S., but I spent a lot of time in Asia as a child. And I saw a lot of poverty, and I saw this lack of upward mobility as a child. And now when I go back, I see a different type of economic mobility. I see a different middle class. I see women in economically improved situations. I see that mobility and improvement, and so that is really exciting to me to see that happening in that side of the world. The other thing that I'm really excited about is, Stephen, we're both parents, and so young people around the world that I meet are amazing everywhere. I feel like whether I'm in Europe or whether I'm in Asia or Latin America, they're innovating in a way that I feel like I wasn't when I was their age. And so that is exciting to me because they are committed to solving some of the problems that we are facing, and they are understanding technology and using technology to kind of solve some of those problems. And so I'm really hopeful when I see our kids, when I see young people around the world trying to find solutions to problems and using innovative ways to find those solutions. It's really exciting for me, and I feel really hopeful about the next 20 years.
Well, thank you. And what a great conversation. It was fascinating as always. And thank you so much for taking the time and sharing all your insights, and look forward to talking again.
Thank you so much for having me, Stephen. Really great conversation.
Thanks, Safia.
And that's a wrap on this episode of Moving the World. Thank you so much to Stephen and Safia. For more insights, listen and subscribe to Moving the World, the Prologis podcast exploring how we live, work, and move. Until next time, keep on moving.